Today is a wonderful day where all the different generations can worship together and celebrate the accomplishments of our children. And it is a great joy to see our children participate in worship together with everyone, to see how much they matter in the life of the church. We see that today in our passage. Jesus shows us how much children matter to him. So after a crowd had followed Jesus and he had finished teaching, some families had brought their children to Jesus so that Jesus could lay his hands on the children and pray for them. Not unlike today when we want our pastors to pray for our kids. It's natural to want a blessing for our children. So some of the parents in the crowd wanted Jesus to bless their children. But as soon as children came up, Matthew tells us that Jesus' disciples rebuked the people from bringing their children to Jesus. Or in other words, complained to the parents their disapproval. Now, why would the disciples be bothered that kids were being brought to Jesus? Seems like an innocent request. We know that in Jewish culture, children are cherished. Psalm 127:3 says that children are a heritage from the Lord and a reward. So what gives? As important as children were during those days, children were also considered less important members of society. They had low status because they had to be taken care of, and a child's role was to listen, be respectful, and learn. Since Jesus was such an important teacher, it's probably likely that the disciples thought that Jesus couldn't be bothered to spend time with kids. So the kids were not important enough to waste Jesus' time. Basically, the disciples saw the children more as an annoyance. The disciples didn't think the kids had enough value to hang out with Jesus. I bet if a Pharisee or a governor wanted to see Jesus, the disciples would have more than welcomed them. And yet, Jesus saw the whole situation differently. Instead of agreeing with the disciples, we see that Jesus tells the disciples to let the children come to him. He tells the disciples not to hinder them. Then he says something amazing. He says, don't hinder them because the kingdom of heaven belongs to kids like these. In other words, Jesus is saying, in God's kingdom, little children who may not be considered valuable or worth much matter. In the Roman world, when Jesus lived, this would have been hard to believe. During the Roman Empire, children were not valued. In fact, if a child angered their dad, the dad could disown, sell into slavery, or kill their child. Children really did not matter. So what Jesus was saying would have been considered crazy. Even though we are not like Romans, we still live in a world where we value people based on outward appearance or what they can or cannot do, or even how hard they will make our lives. A few years ago, I remember reading an article about Denmark and Down syndrome. The article talked about how children born with Down syndrome had fallen sharply in Denmark. Because starting in 2004, the country offered prenatal Down syndrome screening to every pregnant woman, and by offering the test, 95% of pregnant women who had a Down syndrome diagnosis aborted their babies. 95%. So by 2019, only 18 children with Down syndrome were born in Denmark. On one side, you could say that the affected families and the country saved themselves from a lot of heartache and suffering. And I can understand that. Raising children with special needs is not easy, and it can be difficult. I don't want to dismiss that. But on the other side, I am sad, not at the individual decision making, but what it says about a society that collectively, by its decision making, has judged that babies with Down syndrome are unfit for life. When I see what is happening in Denmark, the question arises, are people with Down syndrome not valuable? We may not live in Jesus' time, but we make value calculations of people all the time. I'm willing to say that even the low birth rates of certain countries reflect this attitude too. Economists say the birth rate of Korea is 0.68 children. 0.68, that's the birth rate. If you want to maintain your population, they say each family needs to have 2.1 children. 2.1 children. So Korea is alarmingly low, but so are other rich countries. There are a lot of reasons for such a low birth rate. But one reason that I always hear repeated and has stuck with me is that children are too expensive to raise now. Now, that may be true. But in rich countries where we have never been richer than before, how is it that in poorer countries they can afford to have so many kids with a birth rate higher than 2.1 kids when we cannot? When I hear that it's too expensive to raise kids, sometimes I wonder if what we are really saying is, I cannot have a kid because I cannot maintain my middle class or upper middle class lifestyle. And I cannot guarantee that for any future children. See, what I hear then is seeing future children as a cost valuation. It is a sad world when we see children in such calculating fashion. Even on a personal level, we feel this all the time. Our children feel this all the time. Our culture, especially in Silicon Valley, repeatedly tells our children, you are only worthy if you perform, achieve, or succeed. Many children have believed the lie, they only matter if they get good grades. They only matter if they get into a good college. They're only valuable if you have one of the holy Asian trinity of jobs: doctor, lawyer, engineer. You're only worthy if you're talented, smart, or beautiful. It is no wonder that Generation Z children are the most anxious generation, because as a society, we have told them time and time again, you only matter if you perform or if you do these things. But even as adults, we fall into this lie too. See, I know for parents, we fall into this temptation that our worth is based on how successful our kids are in life. I know we feel tempted to believe that our worth comes from our jobs or our status in our community or our wealth. And here in Silicon Valley, whether you rent a home or you own a home. Because brothers and sisters, this is how the world operates. The world tells us that our worth or value are tied to these things. And yet the beauty of Jesus is that through the example of the children, Jesus tells us our worth, our value is not based on any of those things. Jesus reminds the disciples that even though the world doesn't think the children matter, to him, the children matter. How much do the children matter? Enough to have the keys of God's kingdom. Not based on their status, not based on their performance, and not based on how productive they are. They matter because he says so, or just because. It's by his grace alone. that means that regardless of what the world may think of you, or how much the world devalues certain people, the God of the universe finds you infinitely valuable. Because the one who has infinite worth, infinite value, Jesus, willingly gives his life for you, for us. That means you are infinitely loved, infinitely valued, and you and me, we matter to him just because. Then we don't have to be defined by by what the world considers valuable. Now, you see this? I forgot to bring my UCLA diploma, so I want to use this example. So I have a picture up there, right? So that's a diploma. I have one of those. It came in the mail like that too. I used to believe this defines me. If you don't know, before UCLA, I attended De Anza Community College. Because out of high school, I got rejected by all 5 UCs I applied to. And after those rejections, I felt like I had to prove my worth by transferring to a top-tier university. Because I felt I mattered less than my peers who got into colleges out of high school. So I studied hard and got into my top choice school, which was UCLA. I thought this would give me my worth. Want to know something? This diploma, as you can see, I forgot it. Tells me how much I care. This diploma sits in the folder, in a box, collecting dust. Because ultimately, it's a silly certificate that says, I graduated from a university that no one will remember in a million years. No one's going to care. It is silly to think that this paper defines me, that this paper gives me my worth. The reality is, it doesn't. Don't get me wrong. We should strive and be ambitious, study hard, and do our best. But it is very silly to think these things define us, especially when we already have found our worth in the God who tells us we matter because he says so. To our children, it's because you matter that we want you to be involved in the life of the church. It's why we have these joint worships. It's why we celebrate your accomplishments on graduation Sunday. To practice what Jesus has taught us. You are not an afterthought. You are important in the church and in the eyes of God. To our adults, you matter. You are not defined by your successes or your failures in life. Rest in the knowledge that you are his beloved and that you are an important part of this church that God has called you to. So, let us all continue to encourage and love one another so that the Way Church will be a church when people walk into it that they will know that they are loved and they are valued.